Hello friends, namaste. So as you know that we are continuously discussing about spirituality, not the theoretical spirituality but the practical spirituality which demands an actual transformation in our life. And if we are suffering through problems, maybe it's a psychological problem or a social problem or could be an emotional problem, then can we apply the wisdom in our life in such a way that we can liberate ourselves from the problems, the commonplace problems that we are facing due to our inefficiency? That should be the applied question that we should be asking. And one of the important insight that we are going to learn from today's lesson is going into a deeper esoteric aspect of the Eastern philosophical tradition, but will not be limited to the Eastern philosophy. If we think the world in terms of just a physical world, just like a physicist would think, then anything that is subjective is an epiphenomenon, is a subjective thing that does not have a valid objective existence. So in that sense, suppose if a person is killing another person, then this is just a physical activity that is happening in the physical world, which is governed by the physical rules or mechanistic rules, which are natural laws and principles. So there is nothing wrong if physically or objectively, but as a human being we cannot think like that. Even a physicist just like Newton or Leibniz would not accept that fact, and a whole new dimension of ethics would arise out of that, right? And a purely physicalist viewpoint cannot actually deal with ethics, right? And so there's another way of dealing, looking at these things, which is the spiritual way, religious way, the theological way, or philosophical ways. Although these different disciplines have different perspectives or ways of looking at the same thing, they do not necessarily reduce the world fundamentally into a brutal machine, right? So the whole dimension of ethics has something to do with our two natures. The one is the physical nature, the biological nature, which is governed by the theory of natural selection or the instinct of survival of the fittest, that we want to dominate the other and we want to diplomatically be in a position that we can protect ourselves, our family, our group, our nation, and defend anyone or anything that is supposedly threat to our boundary. That's the instinctual nature, the nature that we have acquired from the animal. And there's another thing, which is a demand to be something more, right? A demand to recognize the whole, a demand to flow into kindness, right? And that's where comes the spiritual traditions, where they have the thesis of Atma or Paramatma, that everything is part of the whole. That's why the fight between the parts is illusory, is a delusion. Basically, a part should be compassionate with another part. That's the basic understanding. However, as a human being, our psyche is largely governed by the conflict between these two natures. One is the nature which is trying to make us an animal, and another is nature which wants to convince us that we are something more than the animal, we are the higher, there's something divine connection between the part and the whole, right? And the whole spiritual or theological or religious traditions belongs to this group. And so there's this fundamental conflict between these two natures, because the higher nature would tell me that these things are driven by my desire, by my body, so they might not be necessarily good for my spiritual growth. However, my lower natural tendency would suggest that this is completely a natural thing to do. There's no question about it. It's a biological fact, right? So there's this conflict, and in this conflict, there's a gray area which is known as ethics. Should I do this? Should I not do this? The whole problem of ethics arises, and in this gray zone, every system of thought is trying to exploit us, is trying to give us truth, is trying to pursue us, is trying to manipulate us, and trying to give us a second-hand knowledge. However, the point is that when in the spiritual tradition we talk about Jīva, we need to understand that the Jīva is not only the ego. Jīva is a confused thing. Jīva is fundamentally, when it gets identified with body, it gets driven by the instincts, or what Darwin would call survival of the fittest. Jīva wants to protect itself. Jīva wants to protect its family. Jīva wants to follow its natural instincts, sexual instincts, or dominating instinct, stereotypical behaviors, just like animal behaviors. However, because in the human mind or in the human psyche, there is another archetype which tries to convince it that it is not only animal, but it could be either God or son of the God, or a creature made out in the image of the God, right? So that's why there's this collective consciousness which is also feeding us different symbols, ideas, scriptures, concepts, models, which tries to make us understand that okay, we are Jīva. When we get identified with the body, and then this natural instinct would dominate us. However, if we do certain practices or certain if we follow certain techniques, the Jīva can identify itself with the Paramatma, or the divine ultimate reality, and get liberated, right? So there are fundamental misconceptions in this understanding. This is a general understanding, but I see a problem here, that most of the time when people try to use some entertaining method or practice or yoga to identify themselves with the Paramatma, what is happening here is that the ego is identifying itself with Paramatma and becoming Paramatma, but ego is not abolished there. However, the fundamental gist of the spirituality is that there's no any practical point of talking about the Paramatma until and unless this Jīva can realize itself that it is a product of conflict between animal nature or God nature, which is inherently present in the human psyche, right? So the point is to realize the Jīva. The point is to realize the limitation of the Jīva, to understand that even when the Jīva is talking about the Paramatma, it's not actually talking about the absolute Paramatma. It is talking about Paramatma of itself, Paramatma that it wants to create, it can relate to, right? So it's the Paramatma of the Jīva. So fundamentally Jīva is there. There is no abolishment of the Jīva. There is no abolishment of the sense of self, right? The sense of selfishness is there, still present. So that's not the essence of true spirituality. So we have to understand that as a Jīva, our position is a natural default conflict between the animal nature and between the God nature. And if you go through all the intellectual traditions, Eastern philosophies, Western philosophy, it's quite clear that people are discussing about the consciousness, right? And for example, existentialists like Sartre is discussing about consciousness, Fichte is discussing about consciousness, Hegel is discussing about consciousness, Kant is discussing about how the mind creates reality, and Plato is also talking about consciousness. He's talking about Platonic world and how that Platonic world is imitated into the lower or apparent reality. So basically all these traditions are trying to suggest that there are two parallel worlds. One is the Platonic world, one is the absolute world, the world of Paramatma, or another is the transient, or the transient world, which is which may be projected by the mind or constructed or modeled by the mind, and which is perceived as a sensation or experience when the sensory organs, including the brain, takes participation in the process of observation or process of seeing, right? So and the whole thing, this conflict between the animal versus God, is happening in the mind. So this whole Mahabharata is going on in our mind. So a Jīva is a battleground where all these ideas, all the thoughts, all the philosophies are fighting with each other. So there is the thought which is purely physicalist. There is thought which is utterly religious, and there are other intermediate thoughts, and the common ground where all these conflict is happening is our mind, human mind. And you can really see it inside yourself if you go deeper into yourself, interrogate. If you are willing to pay the price, then you can see this war is happening inside you. And if you are a very good student of history, and if you see the world, then you can clearly see that this war is also being reflected in the world around us. So the inner and the outer are not separate from each other, and in fact they are mirroring each other. And so this thing is the reality is whole, but it's the human mind which is constantly dividing the whole into parts, and actually these parts are not recognizing that they are part of the whole and fighting with each other. So that's how the domain of conflict arises, right? And when Osho says that I'm not a philosopher, he's saying that he doesn't want to identify himself with any of the philosophies which is inside the domain of conflict, right? So that's why he says I embody all the paradoxes, all the conflicts. So that's one way of looking at the thing, observing everything and then coming up with a fresh eye to look at all those things. And also there's a way of J. Krishnamurti, who wants to deny the authority of each one of these ideas and to have a very alive mind which is free of all the misconceptions, and who wants to look at life not at all of these theories. He doesn't want to understand oneself, understand his self with the lens of a physicalist or lens of a psychologist. He wants to see himself as a human being with fresh eyes, with awareness and attention which is undivided, which doesn't have any biases or center to look at upon it. So, the practical thing here to know is, we can talk as much about Paramatma or the non-dual reality, but that does not give any advantage to our life. So as a suffering human being who is in this mess, the concept of Jīva is far more relevant and far more important for us to understand, because what we are trying to do is, we are not trying to acknowledge that we are Jīva, and we are so keen to run so much interested in identifying oneself with the Paramatma or the higher reality without observing oneself keenly and understanding the true nature of the Jīva, right? So if you just cleanse all the superstitions and these biases in the Eastern intellectual tradition, it's quite clear for you to come to a realization that actually this is very simple thing, that you are the Jīva, you are the limited being. It's a battleground where the conflict between animal nature and God nature is taking place, and sometimes you submit to the animal nature because you are allured or captured by the prakriti, or in the neurochemical or hormonal system. Sometimes the psyche would dominate, and the collective consciousness in your psyche would make you relate with the symbols or the ideas or the knowledge that suggest to you that you are part of the whole and your purpose is to serve the whole. So the conflict between these two fundamental theses is happening in the battleground of our mind or the human psyche, and that's why all the philosophies, theologies, religion is emerging out of this battle. And it is only when we become sakshi or witness to this battlefield, slowly we can understand the concept of Atma or Paramatma. But we are not qualified to investigate on Atma and Paramatma because as of now we are the Jīva, or the individual ego, which has either identified itself with the body, which is driven by the pleasure and pain principle, which is programmed biologically, genetically, and is deeply influenced by the microenvironment where it is cultured. And also another tendency which we supposedly call higher, just because we only know the lower reality and we suffer from the lower reality, we consider this higher, and the attributes we give to the higher reality is something that is free of suffering, right? So the concept of heaven is also related to that. So